George Thompson pushed open the glass door of the upscale clothing store, a soft chime announcing his arrival. The contrast between his worn-out attire and the luxurious environment was striking. His faded blue jeans and frayed brown jacket told a story of a life spent laboring on the railroad, while the sleek displays of designer clothes seemed to whisper tales of wealth and privilege. George took a moment to absorb the atmosphere, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and polished wood. He had a singular purpose today, to find a sweater for his beloved grandson, Tommy. As George stepped further inside, he felt the eyes of the customers and staff briefly settle on him before shifting back to their conversations and purchases. He walked down the aisle, his heart racing with anticipation. He envisioned Tommy's smile when he opened the gift, a small token of love from his grandfather. George approached a display of cashmere sweaters, their soft textures glimmering under the store's bright light. He reached out to touch one, its warmth and quality bringing a sense of comfort amidst the opulence surrounding him. "Can I help you with something, sir?" A voice interrupted his thought. George turned to see Ethan Parker, a young employee with gelled hair and a perfectly ironed shirt, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm looking for a sweater for my grandson," George replied, trying to maintain his composure despite the judgment he sensed in Ethan's gaze. "Right. Well, I hope you know these aren't exactly for everyone," Ethan said, a smirk playing on his lips. "They're quite pricey. You might want to check the clearance section instead." George felt a flush of embarrassment creep onto his cheeks. The way Ethan spoke, as if his mere presence in the store was affront to its elegance, stirred a mix of anger and sadness within him. Yet, he chose to remain calm. "I appreciate your concern, but I believe I can find something suitable," he said evenly, trying to keep the conversation from escalating. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Sure, but just a heads up. If you're looking for something under $100, you're in the wrong place. These sweaters start at $300. George nodded, feeling the weight of Ethan's words. The young man was quick to judge, but George knew that wealth wasn't simply measured in dollars. He had learned that lesson long ago, during years of hard work and sacrifice. As he continued to browse, he caught sight of a beautiful deep blue sweater that seemed perfect for Tommy. Its richness reminded him of the boy's bright eyes, and for a moment, the world around him faded away. "Are you actually going to buy that?" Ethan sneered, now standing uncomfortably close. "You do realize you can't just try on things here without being serious about it? This isn't a thrift store, old man." George turned to face Ethan, his heart pounding. He could feel the eyes of other customers on him, their whispers barely audible but laced with curiosity and disdain. "I'm just looking for a gift," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Trouble? More like you're just wasting everyone's time," Ethan retorted, crossing his arms defiant. "You should know your place." With a deep breath, George fought to keep his dignity intact. He could feel the heat of humiliation rising within him, but he refused to allow Ethan's arrogance to provoke a reaction. "I may not have the kind of money you're used to, but I have something far more valuable. Love for my family," he said softly, his resolve unyielding. "Love doesn't pay the bills," Ethan shot back, his tone sharper now. George, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him, took one last look at the sweater, its threads glimmering like a beacon of hope. He turned away from Ethan, choosing to walk out of the store rather than engage further. As he pushed through the door, he held his head high, the sting of humiliation momentarily overshadowed by a quiet pride. He had come in search of a gift, but what he truly valued, his love for his grandson, remained untarnished. As George Thompson approached the checkout counter, the atmosphere in the luxury clothing store shifted slightly. He pulled out a worn leather envelope from his pocket, his hands steady, despite the earlier humiliation he had endured at the hands of Ethan Parker. The envelope, aged and frayed at the edges, caught the attention of Rebecca, the store manager. She had been observing the interaction with a frown, her brow furrowed at Ethan's earlier condescension. "Is that a special purchase, sir?" Rebecca ventured, her tone neutral yet curious. She had seen the elderly man's quiet dignity, contrasting sharply with Ethan's arrogance. George glanced up, his blue eyes reflecting a lifetime of experience. "Just picking up a little something for my grandson," he replied softly, a hint of pride in his voice as he held up the sweater, its rich hue a stark contrast to his weathered appearance. As George opened the envelope, a crumpled piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the counter. Instinctively, Rebecca leaned closer. Her interest piqued. George picked it up, smoothing the wrinkles with his finger, revealing it to be a military bravery certificate from the Korean War. The paper bore the marks of time, but the words written upon it spoke of courage and honor. "Wow, I didn't know," Rebecca began, her voice trailing off as she recognized the significance of what lay before her. She stepped forward, her eyes wide with respect. "You serve?" "Yes, ma'am," George said, his voice steady but filled with a weight that spoke volume. "I did what I could for my country. It was a different time." Don't miss out on more stories that can change perspective. Subscribe, like, and share with your family. It's a gift that can touch generations. As he continued to search through the envelope, George's fingers brushed against something else, a small gold brooch that gleamed in the store's soft lighting. He held it up, allowing Rebecca to see the intricate design that symbolized his heroism. The brooch sparkled, catching the eye of several customers who had momentarily paused their shopping to witness the unfolding scene. "Is that?" Rebecca stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Medal of Valor?" George nodded solemnly. "It's a reminder of a life I lived, choices I made. It means more to me than any amount of money." Ethan, who had been lingering nearby, now stood frozen in place, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of George's revelation. The weight of his earlier comments pressed heavily on him, and he felt a rush of guilt wash over him. Rebecca turned to Ethan, her eyes narrowed. "This is the kind of person you should be learning from," she said, her tone firm, not judging based on appearance. George, sensing the shift in atmosphere, smiled faintly, but remained focused on Rebecca. "I appreciate the sentiment, ma'am, but I don't need any special treatment. I just want my grandson to have a nice sweater." But Rebecca shook her head, determination etched on her face. "No, Mr. Thompson, your sacrifice deserves recognition. I'd like to gift you that sweater. It's the least we can do to honor your service." George's heart warmed at her unexpected kindness. "That's incredibly generous of you, but I can pay—" "No," Rebecca interrupted gently. "This is a way for us to show our gratitude. Please, let me do this." With a heavy heart, Ethan finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a whisper. I'm sorry for what I said earlier, Mr. Thompson. I can't believe I judged you without knowing who you really are." His words felt hollow, but he meant them. George glanced at Ethan, a mixture of understanding and compassion in his gaze. "It's all right, son. We all have our battles to fight. Just remember, it's not about the clothes we wear or the money we have. It's about the stories we carry within us." Rebecca smiled at George, her respect for him deepening every moment. "You're right. Thank you for your service, Mr. Thompson. The sweater is yours." As George accepted the gift, a sense of closure enveloped him. He had walked into the store seeking a simple gift for his grandson, but he was leaving with something far more valuable, a moment of respect, understanding, and the reminder that true wealth is found in the lives we touch, not the things we possess. George Thompson stepped out of the luxury clothing store, the weight of the new sweater tucked under his arm. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak trees lining the street, and he felt a warmth in his heart, a quiet joy that blossomed from Rebecca's unexpected kindness. As he walked, his worn shoes scuffed against the pavement, he couldn't help but smile. The contrast between the extravagant store and his humble appearance faded away in the light of the moment. Behind him, Ethan Parker stood frozen, a storm of emotions swirling within him. The arrogance that had fueled his earlier remarks now felt like a heavy shroud, suffocating him with guilt. He watched George's retreating figure, the old man's back straight, a testament to his dignity despite the humiliation he had faced. Ethan's heart raced as he replayed the encounter in his mind. The moment he chose ridicule over respect, the moment he failed to recognize a man's true worth. "I can't believe I said those things," Ethan muttered under his breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The laughter of other customers echoed in his ears, a haunting reminder of his callousness. He glanced at Rebecca, who had just stepped out of the store holding the door open, her eyes narrowing as she caught Ethan's gaze. "Ethan, what were you thinking?" she asked, her voice sharp but laced with concern. "That was completely uncalled for." I don't know," Ethan stammered, his bravado crumbling. "I thought he was just some old man who didn't belong in there." Rebecca shook her head, disappointment etched on her face. "You don't understand what you've done, do you? That man fought for this country. He deserves our respect, not your mockery." Ethan's shoulders slumped as he took in her word. The reality of his actions hit him like a cold wave. "I need to apologize," he replied, determination creeping into his voice. "I need to make this right." Days passed, and Ethan found himself haunted by the image of George Thompson. He had seen the old man again, this time at the local church, where he was volunteering to teach math to a group of underprivileged children. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window, illuminating George as he patiently explained fractions to a small group, his voice warm and encouraging. Ethan watched from the back of the room, his heart heavy with regret. "What's wrong?" one of the church volunteers, a friendly woman named Alice, asked as she noticed Ethan's somber expression. "I messed up, Alice," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I treated that man like he was nothing, and he turned out to be someone extraordinary." Alice nodded, understanding etched on her face. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. You should talk to him." Ethan's gaze returned to George, who was now kneeling beside a little girl, helping her with an equation. The gentleness in his demeanor was a stark contrast to the harshness Ethan had displayed. He felt a sudden urge to approach the old man, to bridge the gap his arrogance had created. Gathering his courage, Ethan made his way toward George. The children giggled and chatted, their laughter filling the air like a sweet melody, but his heart pounded with trepidation. He cleared his throat, and George looked up, his kind, weathered face breaking into a smile that melted Ethan's anxiety. "Mr. Thompson," Ethan began, his voice steadying, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to treat you the way I did in the store. I judged you based on your appearance, and I can see now how foolish that was." George's expression shifted to one of understanding, and he nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes, son," he replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "What matters is how we learn from them." Ethan felt a rush of gratitude for the old man's grace. "I'd like to help you at the church if you'll have me. I want to do better, to contribute in a meaningful way." George's smile widened, and he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're welcome to join us any time. We can always use an extra hand, especially when it comes to teaching these kids." As they stood together, the laughter of the children surrounding them, Ethan realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He felt a sense of purpose rising within him, fueled by the desire to change, to be better. Not just for himself, but for those around him. In that small Texas town, amidst the echoes of laughter and learning, a bridge was being built, one that connected the past to a brighter future. The sun hung low in the Texas sky as George Thompson and Ethan Parker sorted through boxes of donations at the local church. The scent of aged wood mingled with the earthy aroma of the outside world, creating an atmosphere of warmth that seemed to wrap around them like a comforting blanket. George, with his weathered hands, sifted through clothes and toys, carefully arranging them for the upcoming charity event. Ethan, still grappling with the weight of his previous arrogance, watched George with newfound admiration. "You really care about these kids, don't you?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. George paused, a soft smile touching his lips. "I do. They deserve a chance, just like anyone else. I've seen too many kids go without what they need." He picked up a small teddy bear, examining it for any signs of wear. "This might not look like much to a child. It can mean the world. Let's fill the world with more stories of compassion and justice. Subscribe now, hit like, and share this with the people you love. Together, we can inspire more hearts." Ethan couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt as he recalled his earlier behavior in the store. "I wish I had understood that sooner," he admitted, his voice low. "I was so caught up in appearances, I didn't see what truly mattered." George chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Life has a way of teaching us what really counts. Sometimes it takes a little humility." As they worked side by side, Ethan found himself gradually opening up. "Can you tell me more about your time in the war?" he asked, curiosity piqued. "I've only heard bits and pieces from others." George's expression shifted, a flicker of nostalgia crossing his face. "It was a different time, son. We were scared, but we fought for each other. I lost good friends out there, men who had families waiting for them back home." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "One night, we were ambushed. I still remember the sounds, the chaos. I saved a man. He was just a kid, really. I'll never forget his face. He didn't make it in the end." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of George's words settle heavily in his heart. "That must have been incredibly hard," he murmured. "How did you cope?" George shrugged lightly. the movement revealing a deep-seated resilience. You learn to carry the memory, but you also learn to let go. You honor them by living a good life. When I lost my wife, it was the same. I had to keep moving forward, for her and for myself. "I'm sorry about your wife," Ethan said softly, his voice sincere. "It must have been devastating." "It was," George replied, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "But I had my grandson. He gave me purpose." We all have our burdens to bear, Ethan, but it's how we choose to carry them that defines us. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself increasingly drawn to George's stories and the depth of his character. The contrast between George's modesty and the arrogance Ethan had once embodied became starkly clear. "I wish I could be more like you," he confessed, wiping his brow from the heat of the day. "You have a strength I can't quite describe." "You can," George encouraged, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "It's a choice we all have to make. Just be true to yourself and others, and you'll find your way." Their bond began to solidify, and with every shared story, Ethan discovered a part of himself that he had long buried beneath layers of superficiality. He felt a sense of responsibility to change, to do more for his community, and to honor the lessons George was imparting. Meanwhile, at the clothing store, Rebecca sat in her office, contemplating the impact George had made in their small town. She remembered the way he had shown grace in the face of adversity, and an idea began to form in her mind. Perhaps it was time to change the narrative of what it meant to be wealthy in her store. A display showcasing George's military certificate would not only honor his service, but also serve as a reminder to customers of the true value of character and kindness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the town, George and Ethan continued their work, each moment drawing them closer together. The past began to fade for Ethan, replaced by a growing desire to contribute positively to the world around him. The unexpected partnership had ignited a spark within him, one that he hoped would burn brightly for years to come. The sun was shining brightly on the small Texas town as George Thompson and Ethan Parker arrived at the local community center, ready for another day of volunteering. The air was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing, a stark contrast to the tension that had once existed between them. George, with his hands weathered from years of hard work, greeted the children with a warm smile. Ethan, now wearing a modest t-shirt and jeans, stood beside him, feeling a newfound sense of responsibility. "Good morning, everyone," George called out, his voice resonating with warmth and authority. The children turned to him, their faces lighting up at the sight of their beloved volunteer. "Today, we're going to learn about teamwork, and I need all of your help." Ethan watched as George effortlessly engaged the kids, recounting stories of his own childhood and the importance of working together. He couldn't help but admire the way George commanded respect without ever raising his voice, an art form he had yet to master. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell us about the time you saved your friend during the war?" One little girl piped up, her eyes wide with curiosity. George paused, the memories flooding back. He took a deep breath, his expression shifting to one of reflection. "Ah, that was a long time ago, but it's a story worth sharing," he said, his voice steady. Ethan leaned in closer, eager to hear the tale. "It was during the Korean War," George began, his gaze distant, as if he were transported back to that time. "I was part of a unit that was surrounded. We were outnumbered, and things looked bleak. But there was this young soldier, my friend, named Jimmy. He was scared, just like the rest of us." George paused, allowing the weight of his words to linger in the air. The children listened intently, their eyes glued to him. "I knew I had to protect him. When the enemy came closer, I made a choice. I crawled through the mud and debris, risking my own life to get to him. I pulled him back to safety, just as the bullets started flying above us." Ethan could feel the tension in the room. The children were captivated, aware that they were hearing something profound. "In that moment, I realized that true bravery isn't just about facing danger," George continued, his voice unwavering. "It's about caring for one another, putting others before yourself." One boy raised his hand, his expression serious. "Did you get hurt, Mr. Thompson?" George smiled softly, his eyes sparkling with memories. "I did get hurt, but it was worth it. Jimmy went on to live a full life because I chose to act. That's what I want you all to remember. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to look out for someone else." Ethan felt a shift within himself. The stories George shared carried lessons far beyond the battlefield. They resonated with the very core of humanity. He recalled moments from his past, filled with superficial pursuits and shallow relationships. Was that really what life was about? He glanced at George, who was completely engrossed in his storytelling, and a wave of humility washed over him. As the session came to an end, Ethan found himself lingering behind. He approached George, who was packing up the material. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice filled with sincerity, "thank you for sharing that story. It really made me think about what it means to be brave." George turned to him, a knowing smile on his face. "Bravery comes in many forms, Ethan. It's not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's simply being there for someone in need." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude. "I've been reflecting a lot on my past actions. I want to be more like you, someone who makes a difference." George placed a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "It's never too late to change, son. Start small, and the impact will grow. Just remember, it's the connections you make with others that truly enrich your life." As they walked out of the community center together, Ethan felt lighter. The burdens of his former life began to dissipate, replaced by the joy of meaningful relationships. He realized that George's true wealth was not in material possessions, but in the legacy of kindness and courage he was building every day. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the stained glass windows of the small church, George Thompson gathered his thing after a long evening of teaching. The classroom still buzzed with the laughter of children, echoing the joy that came with learning. He had just finished explaining a tricky math problem when he noticed a figure lingering in the doorway. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson?" a voice called out, breaking through the echoes of the classroom. George turned to see a tall man in a neatly pressed suit, his demeanor serious yet respectful. "I'm sorry to intrude, but my name is William Hart, and I'm with the Veterans Affairs Office." George's brow furrowed in confusion. "Veterans Affairs? Is there something I can help you with?" "I believe I have news regarding your military service, sir," William said, his voice firm yet kind. "I've been reviewing file, and it appears you are entitled to a substantial military pension due to your service in the Korean War." The words hung in the air, and George's heart raced. He had always lived modest, never expecting much from the government. "A pension? I didn't know," William continued. "Yes, sir. It's a significant amount that could greatly improve your financial situation. You could live more comfortably, perhaps even support some of the community projects you're involved in." George felt the weight of the world shift on his shoulder. He had spent decades working as a humble railroad worker, never seeking recognition or wealth. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, a mixture of surprise and disbelief washing over him. "I never thought much about money, to be honest. But it's not just about the money," William said, his tone earnest. "It's about what you can do with it. You have a chance to invest in your community, to make an even bigger impact." George nodded slowly, contemplating the possibilities. He had always believed that wealth was measured not by financial gain, but by the relationships one built and the lives one touched. The idea of having the means to further his charitable efforts ignited a spark within him. "I'll have to think about how to use it wisely," he finally replied, a gentle smile forming on his lips. As the evening deepened, George walked home, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. He remembered Ethan Parker, the arrogant young man from the clothing store, and how their paths had intertwined. He felt a sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the community that had welcomed him with open arms. The next day, as the sun rose over the Texas horizon, Ethan was busy at the church, helping to set up for a community event. He had changed since that fateful day in the clothing store. His heart had opened to the world around him. When he saw George walking up the steps, a sense of anticipation washed over him. "George!" Ethan called, jogging over. "How was class yesterday? You really have a way with those kids." George chuckled softly. "They keep me young, Ethan, and I have some news for you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" "I just found out that I'm entitled to a military pension," George said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "It's not just about the money. It's what I can do with it for our community." Ethan's eyes widened in realization. "That's incredible, George. You can really make a difference now." "Yes, and I want to start a new program for underprivileged kids to help them with their education and provide resources," George explained, his passion evident. "That's a brilliant idea," Ethan exclaimed. I'd love to help you with. We can organize fundraise and get the community involved." As they stood together, a sense of camaraderie developed between them, a bond forged through understanding and mutual respect. They began discussing plans, their voices filled with enthusiasm and hope. Later that week, the church was abuzz with preparations for the unveiling of the new program, aptly named George's Legacy. The community had rallied around him, inspired by his humility and dedication. As the crowd gathered, George stood alongside Ethan, who had transformed from a self-centered young man to a passionate advocate for change. As the event commenced, George looked out at the faces of his neighbors and friends, their smiles radiating warmth. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "It's about all of us coming together to uplift one another. True wealth lies in the impact we make on each other's lives." The crowd erupted in applause, and George felt a swell of pride. He had become a beacon of hope, and in that moment, he realized that his journey had only just begun. Ethan stood beside him, beaming with admiration, understanding now that true richness was not measured in dollars, but in the love and kindness shared within a community. Looking for stories that restore your faith in humanity? Our playlist offers deeply emotional narratives that will resonate with your heart and soul. Click now to continue this unforgettable journey.